Hi, I'm going to be speaking about developmental psychopathology, which is a discipline that I helped to forge and have continued to be a big part of its development. So developmental psychopathology as a field represents a movement toward comprehending the causes and determinants, pathways, prevention and treatment of individuals who are either at high risk for or who have mental disorders through its synthesis of knowledge from multiple disciplines and levels of analysis. Now, similar to the historical growth witnessed in neuroscience, developmental psychopathology has evolved as a new discipline that is the product of an integration of various disciplines, the efforts of which had previously been separate and distinct. Multiple theoretical perspectives and diverse research strategies and findings have contributed to developmental psychopathology, and in fact, contributions to this field have come from virtually every corner of the biological and social sciences. In order to comprehend maladaptation, psychopathology, and resilience fully, I believe that all levels of analysis need to be examined and integrated. Such research, almost by its very nature, must be interdisciplinary. Multiple levels of analysis research can enhance the understanding of both typical and atypical development, as well as elucidate the links among neuroplasticity, resilience, and preventive intervention. Now, when I was in graduate school, I was asked to write something about developmental psychopathology, very short, let's say 100 words. So I want to read you what I wrote, and we'll see how it projected to today and the future. Okay, here goes. An ongoing goal of developmental psychopathology should be to become a science that not only bridges fields of study, spans the life cycle, infancy to the elderly, and aids in the discovery of important new truths about the processes underlying adaptation and maladaptation, but also provides the best means of preventing or ameliorating psychopathology. Moreover, the field of developmental psychopathology should strive to reduce the dualisms that exist between empirical research and the clinical study and treatment of childhood and adult disorders, between the behavioral and biological sciences, and between basic and applied research. Because psychopathology unfolds over time in a developing organism, it is essential to adopt a developmental perspective in order to understand the processes underlying individual pathways to adaptive and maladaptive outcomes. Next, what is a developmental analysis? What does that mean? Well, a developmental analysis presupposes change and novelty. It highlights the critical role of timing in the organization of behavior. It underscores multiple determinants, and it cautions against expecting invariant relations between causes and outcomes. Furthermore, a developmental analysis is as applicable to the study of the gene or cell as it is to the investigation of the individual, family, or society. A developmental analysis is essential for tracing the roots, etiology, and nature of maladaptation so that interventions may be timed and guided as well as developmentally appropriate. Accordingly, such a developmental perspective may add in the prevention and reduction of the individual, familial, and social burden of mental disorder. It may alleviate the onus of suffering that mental illness engenders in individuals, family, and the communities in which they reside. And finally, they contribute toward eliminating the stigma commonly associated with the presence of mental disorder. Okay? Now, there are some principles that characterize the field. I'll give you 6 of them. One is that there's a mutual interplay between normality and psychopathology. And this interplay is bidirectional. For many, many years, the focus had been on the contributions that normal development made to atypical development, but recently there's also been a focus on how can atypical development enhance our knowledge of normal development. Historically, just to give you a quick one, there are a few disciplines, as I mentioned, that are associated with developmental psychopathology, and especially with the relation between normal and abnormal. One is embryology. And there were 2 big people, Waddington and Paul Weiss, both of whom studied atypical embryos to see what it could teach us, what they could teach us about normal embryogenesis. I used to be quite an athlete, you know. Anyway, then in neuroscience, we had John Ewlings Jackson. And in psychiatry, just some that popped in my mind were Eugen Bleuler, Kurt Goldstein, and Michael Rudder, my colleague and friend for many years. The second principle is that there's diversity in process and outcome. So another important principle is that there is this diversity in process and outcome. So for example, let's say we have children who have experienced similar forms and types of child maltreatment during their early childhood. These may have different developmental consequences, even though they had very similar beginnings. These diverse adult outcomes resulting from the same early maltreatment experiences are examples of what we call multifinality. Alternatively, individuals with diverse childhood may both develop, let's say depression, although their developmental pathways to the disorder are dissimilar. This is an example of what we call equifinality, the concept that different initial states and processes can lead to the same end state. Now, when designing and implementing interventions for individuals who have suffered adverse consequences following the experiences of chronic or toxic stress and child maltreatment, the concepts of multifinality and equifinality should be taken into account really at the beginning of designing the intervention. I believe that prevention and intervention efforts are more likely to be efficacious if these diverse pathways are considered at the outset, as I said. Okay. Good. Okay, the third principle is multiple levels of analysis. Because each level of analysis both informs and constrains all other levels, psychopathology cannot be understood fully unless all levels are examined and integrated. Moreover, since levels of organization and processes are reciprocally interactive, it is difficult, if not impossible, to impute ultimate causation to one level over another. When disciplines function in isolation, they run the risk of creating theories that ultimately will be incorrect because vital information from other disciplines has either been ignored or is unknown. As is true in systems neuroscience, it's essential that psychopathologists and research utilize all levels of analysis about relevant complex systems. The fourth principle, and there's a very nice article in the journal Comprehensive Psychiatry in 2019 by Ted Beauchesne, John Constantino, and Elizabeth Hayden. And that's that developmental psychopathology is a trans-disciplinary science. It's not possible to comprehend fully the functioning and developmental trajectory of an analysis through from one discipline. As individual disciplines accumulate more knowledge about normal and abnormal development, developmental psychopathology has grown increasingly inter- and transdisciplinary and collaborative in nature to create models that accurately characterize the developmental pathways from early stress and adversity to later functioning. Moreover, interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research can inform prevention and intervention efforts through their broad assessments of individual functioning and biological and environmental factors that may influence intervention effectiveness. Principle number 5, resilience. Resilience is a dynamic developmental process that encompasses an individual's capacity to positively adapt in the face of significant adversity. Resilience is not trait-like, nor is it static. Rather, it's a construct that's multidimensional and that can change over time. One mechanism through which individuals might be able to develop resilient functioning happens on a neurobiological level through what's called neuroplasticity. That's a process that results in the reorganization of neural pathways across the course of development. Accordingly, experience can result in physiological and structural changes in the brain. It's important to acknowledge that the nature of the relationship between the brain and experience is bidirectional. Experience helps shape the neural pathways in the brain, and then this newly shaped brain seeks out different experiences which further alter neural pathways. Throughout the course of development, neuroplasticity is guided by the creation of synapses due to the input of new sensory information into the nervous system. Now, this is called experience-dependent plasticity. It involves the brain's adaptation to sensory information that is unique to the individual. Unlike what's called experience-expectant plasticity, experience-dependent plasticity has no temporal aspect. Thus, it can occur at any time throughout the lifespan. And furthermore, in contrast to experience-expectant plasticity, experience-dependent plasticity creates new synapses instead of pruning existing synapses. Plasticity is necessary to shape development by responding to ongoing experiences and challenges. Neuroplasticity from the molecular to the systemic level is essential for normal development. Importantly, neuroplasticity does not remain stable throughout the lifespan, as experiences that occur during periods of neurodevelopment are more likely to have enduring effects on functioning. In humans, it's the prenatal and early postnatal years that are associated with the greatest neuroplasticity. Consequently, stressful experiences that occur early in life are considered to be particularly important for shaping neurodevelopment. One thing I want to say as an aside, I'm the editor of a journal called Development and Psychopathology. We have special issues every year, typically 2 special issues. And one that I would like to just call your attention to read about some of these things I've been saying, is a special issue we have on the developmental origins of normal development and psychopathology. That's 2018 Development and Psychopathology. Next, Principle 6, Prevention and Intervention. Prevention scientists strive to intervene in the course of development to reduce or eliminate the emergence of maladaptation or mental disorder. Moreover, they also seek to foster the recovery of function and to promote resilient adaptation in individuals at high risk for psychopathology. In order to fulfill these important goals, it's critical that prevention scientists possess a complex, multi-level understanding of normality to formulate an in-depth representation of how deviations in normal development processes can eventuate in maladaptation and psychopathology. According to a developmental psychopathology framework, what are called randomized control trial interventions, or abbreviated RCT small s. These can be conceptualized as veridical experiments in modifying the course of development. Thus, these randomized control trial interventions can be conceived as tests of theory and causal mechanisms, therefore proffering insights into the etiology and consequences of maltreatment, maladaptation, and other disordered outcomes. Discovering the multiple levels at which change is engendered through RCTs will provide more insight into the mechanisms of change, the extent to which neuroplasticity may be promoted by interventions, and the interrelations between biological and psychological processes in maladaptation, psychopathology, and resilience. It's thus possible to conceptualize efficacious, resilience-promoting interventions as examples of experience-dependent neuroplasticity. If assessments of biological systems are routinely incorporated into the measurement batteries employed in resilience, facilitating interventions, then we will be in a position to discover whether the nervous system has been modified by experience. Other important considerations, such as when, by that I mean the timing, and why a disorder occurs, how long it persists, and what precursors to the disordered functioning can be identified, all require a developmental analysis to ensure that prevention and intervention strategies are appropriately timed and guided. The lifespan perspective that characterizes a developmental psychopathology approach underscores that even adults, so sometimes when you hear developmental, people think, well, we only deal with infants and children, maybe adolescents. But that's not true. Even adults and elderly persons continue to be confronted with challenges that present opportunities for new strengths or usher in new vulnerabilities. Thus, I think that the developmental timing of preventive intervention may be even more critical than its particular contents. Okay. Am I correct that I have 17 minutes left?
Yes.
Okay.
You have 17 minutes left.
Yeah, okay. Before the field of developmental psychopathology could emerge as a new discipline, the science of normal development needed to mature, and a broader basis of firm results needed to be obtained. Now, as dramatic gains in developmental neurobiology, neurodevelopment, neuroimaging, and molecular genetics have occurred in concert with an enhanced comprehension of immunological, hormonal, emotional, social, cognitive, and representational processes, the field of developmental psychopathology now has a much stronger ability to utilize knowledge of normative development as a yardstick against which to measure psychopathology. Okay. I'll talk next about some need for future. And the thing I want to address is cultural development and psychopathology. During its early years, developmental psychopathology was considered to be at risk of becoming a monocultural science. As the discipline matured, more integrative approaches to understanding risk, resilience, and psychopathology among culturally diverse groups have emerged. In fact, this is another special issue in development and psychopathology, also in 2018. In the 2018 special issue, it was devoted to cultural development and psychopathology. Research conceived within a developmental psychopathology perspective has elucidated various pathways to adaptation in different cultural, racial, and ethnic groups. The increased understanding that has emerged as a function of a broader and more accurate perspective on development within specific cultural groups possesses significant implications for understanding and treating mental illness as well. There's a great need for much more research that integrates cultural development into developmental psychopathology, including, one, investigating the ways in which culture affects biology, two, incorporating assessment of individual and society-level cultural processes, and three, learn the best ways to integrate culture into interventions. Another sort of thing I want to talk about is like neurobiological and behavioral approaches to prevention and intervention. In 2008, I wrote a paper with Megan Gunner, one of my colleagues in Minnesota, and it was of the importance of integrating biology into behavioral interventions. The time has come to increasingly conduct interventions that not only assess behavioral changes, but also investigate whether abnormal structures, functions, and organizations are modifiable by or are refractory to therapeutic alteration. Successful preventive intervention may alter behavior and physiology through producing alterations in gene expression that created a new structural organization, or reorganization, I should say, in the brain. These data provide biologically plausible hypotheses about how effective interventions function to impact development. One goal of preventive intervention work is to better sensitive periods of intervention. Implementing preventive interventions during the developmental stages when the neural circuits are most plastic and amenable to change, I think is likely to have the biggest impact. If biological systems recover in response to an intervention, then this supports arguments that the system under study is sensitive to environmental input during development. Furthermore, if randomized intervention alters neurobiological systems associated with disorders, and it can be shown that they mediate changes in psychosocial and behavioral functioning, then this would foster a better understanding of the neurobiological bases of disorder. Okay, next we're going to be talking briefly about genetics and epigenetics and preventive intervention. Research on gene-environment interactions and on epigenetics needs to incorporate as well as emphasize a developmental perspective. I know a lot of this is not thought highly of these days, but let's pretend G by E, which people have a lot of doubts about, but even for that, it should have been G by E by D, development, or even put development before G and E. Genes may affect how environmental experience affects the developmental process, and this may operate differently at different developmental periods. Moreover, the effects of genes and experience at a particular period may be influenced by the effects of prior development. More recently, epigenetic processes, and by that is meant changes in the genome that are functionally relevant but that do not alter the nucleotide sequence, such as chemical modifications, such as DNA methylation, histone modification, too. These alter the gene expression and have become of interest to researchers in developmental psychopathology. And these changes have been targeted as a pathway by which child adversity, such as stressful separations from your parents, living in poverty, child abuse early, etc., is embedded to confer risk for disorder. Now, epigenetic processes play a dynamic role in regulating gene expression, and they are responsive to the environment. Epigenetic regulation of gene expression occurs independently of DNA sequences, as I said earlier, and operates primarily through changes in methylation and chromatin structure. Although epigenetic changes can be reversed, they are often long-lasting across the course of development. But their implications for intervention, and there was a recent paper, I think, by Kieran O'Donnell, and the last author was Michael Meany, and they looked at an intervention that had gone on for 27 years, and they looked at DNA methylation and so on, and the individuals who had received the intervention had way less methylation than those who didn't. So it's starting to be incorporated. And they may be realistic targets for intervention because epigenetic mechanisms are supposedly, from what I've read, reversible. Okay? So, questions you would ask. I mentioned Kieran O'Donnell's study as one. Does intervention affect DNA methylation, resulting in changes in gene expression? Question, and that's kind of partly what O'Donnell showed. DNA methylation changes in response to experience could lead to the design of both prevention and intervention strategy that change the expression of genes to promote healthy physical and mental health outcomes. Just another little quick one. In 2016, we had an issue on epigenetics and development in psychopathology. I recommend that those of you interested in this take a look at it. And finally, given that the epigenome, the demethylated epigenome, would be translated to the next generation, it's going to be important to determine if decreased, let's say, child maltreatment risk through efficacious intervention alters the epigenome, which in turn would result in a, quote, less risky epigenome being transmitted to the next generation. So there's a lot of exciting developmental questions besides just basic epigenetic questions that can be addressed future-wise. Okay, let's see what I want to say. Through its principles and tenets, developmental psychopathology transcends disciplinary boundaries and provides fertile ground for moving beyond mere symptom discretion, beyond mere symptom description to a process-level understanding of normal and atypical developmental trajectories. I think this has been talked about earlier in our meetings here today, last night. The developmental psychopathology perspectives provides a broad integrative framework within which the contribution of separate disciplines can be fully realized in the broader context of understanding individual functioning and development. If its contributions to date presage future advances, then I believe that developmental psychopathology will continue to engender much enthusiasm and to foster significant advances in our knowledge of normal and atypical development. It's important to be able to integrate different levels of analysis, development, genetics, biology, neurodevelopment, behavior, emotion, cognition, context, culture, longitudinally. The key to further progress in this field, and I think that could be very helpful to other fields, such as, I have great respect for psychiatry, so don't worry about that, to integrate psychiatry with developmental psychopathology. And the key to further progress in this field is the continued emphasis on the concept of development. Thank you.